Well, hello guys. It's been a little bit since I've talked to you. And yes, I know I look different today, don't I? Yes, I am dressed up like a pioneer. So I don't know if you remember, but near the end of the school year, we would have had a little simulation, which is like we kind of pretend to have an Apple Valley school, which is a pioneer school. So I'm dressed up in my pioneer dress and my pioneer apron and my pioneer nightcap. I made this outfit, probably almost 20 years ago or more. And so I've had it for a really long time. And I wear it every year. So you might remember when I was dressed up last year when you saw me in the hallways probably. But so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what pioneer schools were like. I have my antique desk right here, and I'll show you a better picture of it in a little bit. But this is the kind of desk that students sat at. So the seat is here, the back is here, and then the table is behind them. So the next desk, which would be just like this one, would be sitting in front of this one, and it would have the back part for this student to write on, and then the next student would sit on the seat in front of that. And so that's what the desks look like. They were wooden like this. The seats do flip up, so you can flip them up and then flip it back down. I've always wanted an antique desk, an antique school desk, so a few years ago I was able to buy one from an antique dealer. And so I thought it would be very fitting to do this in my upstairs, in my loft, because it looks like a log cabin, which is the kind of homes that the people lived in when pioneer times were happening. And so I'm going to read to you what the simulation would have been. We would have read this in class, so I'm just going to read it to you now, so that way you have an idea what this would have been all about. So Apple Valley School, student guide. You are about to begin a simulation called Apple Valley School. You will find out what it was like to attend a one-room school about 100 years ago. Your school is called Apple Valley School. The simulation begins when you are given a new name, a new age, and a family history. Your pioneer teacher will tell you how you can earn points to graduate from Apple Valley School at the top of your class. So everybody would have been given a name tag, and it would have had your name on it, which would have been a different name. It would have been from one of the families that are in this simulation. And if you remember back, I believe it's, again, chapter 5 in our Michigan Studies book, we had a big photograph of a family, and it was the Baker family. Do you remember anything about us talking about it way back when? I know it was a while ago, but that would have been one of the families that some of you would have been a part of. And so you would all have been given a name tag with a new name. And I take on my grandmother's name during Apple Valley days because my grandmother was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, just like the Apple Valley school days. And so her name was Miss Myers. So I would take on her name during Apple Valley School. Let me read on. Background essay. Why schools were established. Children learned in other ways before schoolhouses were built and school teachers were hired. Parents and grandparents taught children the skills they needed to survive. Boys learned how to cut down trees, build houses and barns, plant and harvest crops, and care for the animals. Girls learned how to clean, cook, spin, sew, and take care of younger children. Parents who wanted their children to read or to learn math had to teach them at home, kind of like what we're doing right now. Some sent them to church where the minister could teach them a little bit. Most early settler families were too busy working to build schools for their children. Later, families became more settled. They built houses and ran their farms smoothly. Parents thought more about providing an education for their children. They now had more time to build a schoolhouse. Parents no longer needed as much help at home. Their children now had free time to go to school and learn. Families in a community worked together to build their children a schoolhouse. They each gave a small amount of money to pay the teacher's salary. Children years ago did not start school every year in September as children do today. Parents still needed their children to help at home during the spring and fall to plant the harvest crops. These early schools were usually open only in the winter and in the summer. So a little bit different than ours. They had like a fall break and a spring break, but those were so they could actually help plant the crops and harvest the crops from the fields. The first schoolhouses were often built on land unsuitable for farming or on roads near the center of town. Like most homes, schoolhouses were built of logs, if enough trees were available. Most had dirt floors. Windows had greased paper instead of glass. Children usually sat on long benches and worked at narrow tables. And if we would have been able to go on our field trip to Sauter Village, which I did put a virtual field trip to there on this Google slide show this week, you would have been able to see the schoolhouses of this time period with the long benches and the greased paper instead of windows. The first schoolhouses were often either too hot or too cold because it was the time of the year that they had school. It was either in the summer when it's hot or in the winter when it's cold. The rooms were heated by a smoky fire or a stove. Children sitting near the fire got too hot. Others far away from the fire got too cold. Summers were miserable. Many schools were built without trees for shade and without windows for which could open. The schoolhouses could be as hot as an oven. It was very hard for the children to learn when they were so uncomfortable. Early schoolhouses had very little equipment. There might be only one blackboard, a map, a bell, a few books, and slates. Slates were small chalkboards that children used instead of paper, kind of like the whiteboards that we use during math time. Those would be kind of like the modern day or the today version of the slates that they used way back when. Paper was scarce and expensive. Before pencils were invented for writing, children used goose quill pens and charcoal. Children had few school books, so they often brought their own books from home and shared them with other students. Now I'm going to talk about a student's day. In one-room schoolhouses, children of all ages learned in the same room with the same teacher. Children as young as 4 or 5 in the same class as teenagers as old as 19. Some of the students might even be older than the teacher. Even when their ages were different, children read together in the same reader. The teacher often worked with just 1 or 2 students at a time. The rest of the class was expected to work alone or help each other. So kind of like our math station time, how I pull groups back to the table and other students are working on other things by themselves. That's kind of how the Apple Valley schools were run. Before coming to school in the morning, children had to wake up very early. They did their chores before they walked to school. After a long school day, children had to walk home, do homework, and finish their evening chores. Many times, children were needed at home to help out with the work. If they had to miss school, they fell behind in their studies. Often, the oldest child in a large family didn't get to attend school at all. Those boys and girls were needed at home. Lessons in early schools. Early schools had few books and little paper. Most lessons were recited out loud or being written instead of being written down. Schools were often called blab schools. It was very noisy when all the students blabbed, which means they recited something together. Kind of like when we read our spelling sentences on the board, that's when we blab, is when we read it out loud together. Students were expected to memorize and recite a great deal. Things to memorize might include passages from poetry and the Bible, math facts, grammar rules, history dates, place names on the map, and spelling words. People in the 1800s had different ideas about what was important to learn in school. Handwriting was one of the most important subjects. Children were also urged to read aloud with expression in early schools, kind of like we ask you to do with your fluency today. In some lesson books, sentences were written up and down across the page to show the students how their voices should go up higher or they should go lower. The most exciting part of the week was the weekly spelling bee. The best speller in the school was only second in importance to the best mathematician. Some teachers also taught practical lessons on things like farming and sewing. So think back when we did our spelling bee for the grade that we were going to do and then send somebody to the Lenawee County Spelling Bee. So they would have one of those once a week, and the top speller was a super important person. Pioneer teachers often made fun of children who had trouble learning. Now, we wouldn't do that today, but it sounds like that's what they did back then. Children had to wear dunce caps, stand in corners, or stand on blocks of wood. Some were even beaten. Certain teachers made students miss recess, clean the school, or carry firewood as punishments. When a child got in trouble at school, his brothers and sisters would often tell to their parents. Most likely, the parents would then punish the child a second time. A teacher's life. Okay, now we're going to talk about what the teacher had to do during the pioneer days. The first teachers in early schools were usually men. They weren't women, they were men. Parents expected the schools to teach their children proper morals and behavior. They felt the only way to teach these things was to be strict and harsh. Most people felt that men were better able to punish children than women, so they thought punishing was important, so they thought the men could do a better job because they could be more stern and the kids would listen better. Teachers were generally paid very little. They usually had to stay with different families in the area. Moving from house to house during the year was called boarding around. Teachers were expected to work very hard for their small pay. School duties included filling the lamps, cleaning the chimney, bringing in water and coal, and trimming quill pens. Duties outside the school might include visiting the sick, kind of like what pastors do today, reading to the blind, reading the sermon at church, and even digging graves. Teachers were expected to follow a very strict set of rules. They could be fired at any time if they broke the rules. So boarding around. So if this was pioneer times, then I would come stay at one student's house for a week or two, and then I would go to another student's house for a week or two, and I just kept moving around from family to family throughout the year because I didn't have my own home. I had to stay with the students and their families. It was very hard for women to get teaching jobs at first because people did not think they could discipline the children. Many of the boys might be older and taller than a young woman teacher. They often tried their best to make a new woman teacher quit, so they would do things to her to make her get mad and leave. People in town were also quick to find fault with women teachers. In most towns, married teachers were not allowed. A woman had to be very dedicated and determined to becoming a teacher in pioneer days. So other types of early schools. Long ago, there were several other types of schools besides the blab school. These blab schools and one-room schoolhouses were most common in poor farming areas. Other kinds of schools were available to wealthy people and to those who lived in the city. Many children of wealthy families were sent to expensive private boarding schools. The word boarding means that the children lived at the school instead of in their own homes. Children at such schools had long days of studies and were often homesick for their families. So they would go and stay at the school in the city, and they wouldn't get to come home and see their families only on holidays. Many wealthy girls were sent off to finishing schools. These schools were boarding schools where girls learned French, dancing, embroidery, and the manners to finish their education. Girls at finishing schools also suffered from homesickness. Although they learned manners, they still thought a great deal about their parents, brothers and sisters, and their homes many miles away. In the cities, poor children who wanted an education could be sent to ragged schools. These schools were called ragged schools because the children had little money and old and tattered clothing. At ragged schools, the children worked to pay for their education and for their food. They all made shoes, furniture, and clothes and helped take care of the school. So the children had to work. That probably wouldn't go over very well today, would it? Any children who did not come to work or who did not do their lessons were not allowed to eat. Each night the children returned to their homes to see their parents and to sleep. Other poor children got their education through an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship means that a trained person taught children a skilled craft like blacksmithing, silversmithing, or milling. The child would work with the expert for several years to learn the trade. These craftspeople often taught the children other things like reading, writing, and also math. So that kind of gave you some history of what the Apple Valley School was all about. Now I'm going to get up and I'm going to change the camera on the phone so you can see my antique desk a little bit better. So the chair that I'm sitting in is also made of sticks. So if you look at the chair, it's a rocking chair and it has sticks for the frame and branches for the frame. So this would often be the same kind of chair that you might see back in those days because that's what they used, what they had around them, which was trees and branches. So now I'm going to show you a couple of things that I have collected over my time here. So here's the antique desk that the students would sit in. So up here on the top, you can see there's a tray. This is where the pencil would lay. Well, it wasn't the pencil, it was their quill pen or whatever they used at the time. So that was the top. And then there was the seat. And like I showed you, the seat would fold up so people could walk through the aisles if they needed to. But you can see it has a wrought iron frame at the bottom. It's very, very heavy. It takes all I can do to just move it. So that's the desk that the students would sit on. And then when the pioneer families would come from whatever country they were coming from, and they would come across the Erie Canal on the boats, they would often put their belongings in a big trunk like that. I inherited this trunk from my grandfather, but my ancestors brought this over from Germany with them when they came to the United States. So this trunk is over 100 years old, and so it would be very fitting for this trunk to probably have come with the pioneers at that time. Well, I hoped you enjoyed my lesson. I hoped you enjoyed my lesson of Pioneer Days. And yes, this is a silly outfit, but this is what I would have been wearing if we would have been at school. Um, so I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you enjoy the virtual field trips that go along with it.